So 2018 was an exciting year because there was a biological annotation of the genetic loci associated with intelligence in a meta-analysis of about 87 or 88,000 people. And as we know, IQ, variance in IQ is associated with a wide variety of health outcomes. And we tend to say that about 1% of the population suffers from an intellectual disability. Of course, this is merely relative, as we can define an intellectual disability however we like. So relative to people who are of an IQ of 170, I would argue that we are intellectually disabled. So obviously the proper proactive approach here is to genetically engineer everyone so that we can all be at a higher IQ and therefore not be disabled relative to some other just as arbitrary definition. Okay, so what happened here? What happened with this meta-analysis? Why is this so interesting? Well, that's because for about a century, we've been looking for the neural underpinnings of intelligence and haven't found them. And now we are very, very close, if not already there. And we will have genetically engineered humans very soon, because if the US doesn't do it for some prudish reason, China is going to do it. And even if you get an international agreement where you get the US and China to both agree to not do it, you're going to get some mercenary lab in Tanzania, and people are just going to be immigrating there to get higher IQ children. So IQ accounts for a lot of things. It accounts for how much scientific or mathematical prowess you're going to have, things you can do that you couldn't otherwise do. So in the same way that people are retarded relative to you, you are retarded relative to someone who is of an IQ of 170 or 180. If they could be as slow as you were, it would be the same amount of difference as if you had been degraded to someone you consider retarded. So obviously, we should raise our collective intelligence. As a population, we should democratize this. It's an issue that has always been important for me, not as some kind of morbid interest that it's just out of curiosity, but really as an issue, because Hispanics, for example, have an average IQ of 90. And the reason that I turned out differently was because my mom actually went and got in vitro fertilization, and they do have a screening process for the donors there. And so that's the only reason I turned out differently. But like I said, I'm still intellectually disabled relative to a lot of people, and so are you. And IQ accounts for so much. It accounts for so much in terms of how likely you are to have influence in the world, to have power in the world, to have money in the world, to have good health in the world, to live longer. IQ accounts for so many things. There's tremendous amount of evidence, and political correctness doesn't help anyone. It does help someone. I mean, it helps the people who are already benefiting from a higher IQ to stay in power and keep their boot on top of your head. So let's be honest about this. We had this genome-wide association study, which is abbreviated as GWAS. And we had a bunch of genome-wide association studies. We had one specifically with IQ, and we wanted to find the brain tissues, and we wanted to find the specific cell types that are implicated, specific cell types. So we had data on single cell gene expression, and we had data on brain tissues. With the genome-wide association study, it wasn't chump change. It was like 78,000 individuals was the population. By the way, in these scientific papers, N just means the population size. And then we had to compare this with a study on people who had an IQ of about 170. So they did a meta-analysis with this, where you had you compared people who had an IQ of about 170 with your control group, and this was like 1,200 people, and this was, if I remember correctly, 8,200 people. This is substantial. It's a substantial study, and we actually were able to, from this meta-analysis, get as a result the actual specific neuron types. So we have these neurons that were implicated in intelligence, which turned out to be pyramidal neurons in your somatosensory cortex and in your hippocampus. Pyramidal neurons in your somatosensory cortex, somatosensory cortex, and in your CA1 region of your hippocampus. So your hippocampus tends to be associated with memory, and your somatosensory cortex tends to be associated with more receiving all the inputs for processing. So your visual and all kinds of inputs. And also we had embryonic GABAergic neurons. Embryonic GABAergic neurons in your midbrain. And your midbrain is more of an older region of your brain, an earlier region of your brain. So it does all the visual inputs and auditory processing also. So all of these three regions were implicated. When they did the specific tissue analysis, they found that most of the difference in gene expression tended to be in the front cortex, in the front of your brain. So this is very exciting because now we actually have specific targets. Now we know where this intelligence is coming from in terms of the specific cells and in terms of the specific genes coding for those cells associated with genes code for proteins, and then those proteins go on to build those cells. So this is very important and very interesting. It is the most important issue, really, because this is intelligence is what could solve every other issue, right? We could argue that the main issue currently, at least for the human species, is aging, because aging affects everyone, and we haven't solved it, right? But if we had more high IQ individuals, we could solve it. If everyone was at 170, we would, forget just solving health. In a matter of decades, we would get the singularity. This would be enough to precipitate the singularity. Forget about solving artificial general intelligence with just a few random smart people. What if your standard base population for all humanity was at 170 IQ? And there's no reason that it should stop at 170. I mean, we could go above that as we perfect these techniques and discover more about what actually are the neural underpinnings of intelligence. So this is very exciting, and it's the most important thing that we could be working on as humans at the moment.